Hi everyone, I'm Aria. Welcome back to my channel. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and if you're able to support me even further, you can become a member of my Patreon page where you get access to many of my blend files as well as some sound effects. Today we're going to be making a Halloween themed cloth simulation. Okay, here we go. First we need to open up a new scene in Blender, and then you can just hit A to select everything and hit delete. Next, we want to add our ground plane, so let's hit Shift A, go to Mesh, and we'll click Plane. Then let's scale this up by hitting S to scale and typing in 10. Next, let's hit Shift A, Mesh, and we're going to add a UV sphere. G to move, Z to lock to the Z axis, and we'll type in 6. Right click and Shade Smooth. Shift A again, Mesh, and we'll click Cylinder. Next, we want to scale this on the X and Y axis, so hit S to scale, then hold Shift and hit Z, which will just exclude the Z axis. Then you can type in 0.4. Now we're just going to bring this up by hitting G to move, Z, and we can type in 5. Next, we'll rotate it, so hit R to rotate. In my case, I'm going to be rotating on the X axis, which is the red line here, so just make sure that if you're facing this way, you'll be rotating on the Y, but either way will work just fine. Okay, so R, X, and then I'm going to type in 45, and since I wanted to go the opposite way, I'm going to type in minus. Now we just want to bring it over, so hit G to move, Y to lock to the Y axis, and we can just drag our mouse over. So we want to do this on the other side, but instead of doing that all again, we can just come over to the modifiers properties, click here, and we're going to add a mirror. Then in our case, we want to mirror it on the Y axis, which is our green line here. So we're going to click Y and turn off the X. So you'll just quickly see that obviously we're not getting a mirror. So the reason why that is if I hit N on the keyboard to open up our transforms, you'll see that these are all the values that we typed in with our scale, rotation, and our movement. But in order for Blender to calculate our mirror properly, these need to all be default. So just make sure you've got the cylinder selected, and you can hold Control and hit A. Then we'll click All Transforms. Now you'll see that the mirror is working right away and everything is set back to default. So next we can add our cloth. So we're going to hit Shift A, Mesh, and we'll click Plane. Then we just want to bring it up above our sphere. So hit G to move, Z, and type in 7.5. Alright, so let's scale our cloth by hitting S and typing in 8. And now the last thing that we need to do before we add our cloth simulation is to subdivide our mesh so that it can bend on different vertices. Tab to go into edit mode. Right click and we're going to go to subdivide, and if you just go down to the bottom left here, you'll see this little menu, and I'm going to set mine to 100. Okay, so hit tab to go back into edit mode. By the way, you can also click here to choose your mode. And of course, with any simulation, you want to make sure that you're on frame 1 just because it'll start calculating as soon as you add some type of physics. Then we can just go over to the right and click the physics properties and click cloth. Most of these settings are going to be okay, but let's just add a bit of resistance. So let's change both the bending to 1 for the stiffness and the dampness. Then we'll scroll all the way down and open collisions. Set this a little bit higher, and very important, make sure to activate self collisions as well. So now we're basically ready with our cloth settings, but before we simulate, we need to make sure that we add some collisions. So let's click on our sphere, head over to the physics properties and add collision. Then if you just come all the way down to the soft body and cloth, you can change the damping to 1 and the friction all the way up to 80. Then we want to do the same for our other objects, so click our cylinder, which by the way we're done mirroring, so we can just head over to the modifiers properties, click this arrow if you're using 2.9 and hit apply. Then just below that in the physics we can go to collision, again set our damping to 1 and our friction to 80. Finally, let's click our ground plane, add a collision, damping all the way up to 1 and friction to 80. Awesome, so now we're ready to simulate, so click our cloth and let's just name this cloth, just so we don't get confused with our ground plane here, which we can also name if you want. Click back on the cloth, then we can scroll all the way down to the cache settings, open up the cache settings, and even though we're doing a longer simulation, we really only need about 80 to 100 frames. So you can just type in 100 and then hit bake. Okay, so that should only take a minute or so. Then once it's done, you can hit play and check out the simulation. So it's looking really good. Obviously it's a little rough, so let's just right click and shade smooth. You will see some edges here, but later on we're going to add a subdivision surface. Then I just want to find a frame that looks really good. In this case, a frame 100 is just fine. Make sure that you're in the modifiers properties. Click this little arrow and apply. Okay, so again, make sure that you're on frame 1. And we just want to do a couple things just before we move on. First of all, we can just make sure that we've got our cloth selected. So let's hold Control and hit A. And we'll select all transforms, which fixes our transforms here. But you'll see now that our pivot is at the world origin. So right click, go to set origin, and you're going to click origin to geometry. Now you'll see that our center point is more in the center of our cloth. Okay, so now the next thing we want to do is add a new cloth simulation and have our ghost move forward. So the first thing we need to do is click on our ground plane, and we want to add more. So let's just go over to the modifiers properties, click here, and we're going to add an array. In my case, it's the x-axis. I'm going to type in -1. Then I'm going to set the count to 6. The order of these modifiers matters, so we've got our collision on our ground plane, but if we remove our array, you can see that it's only this square. So what we need to do is, once we add our array, we need to just grab and move this above. This way it'll take into account all 6 of our repeats. Click the cloth, and we can now add our cloth modifier. Head over to the physics properties. Sometimes this takes a second to show up. You can just re-click your mesh if it doesn't. Click on cloth. Then this time we're going to add a bit more tension and compression. So let's set those to 25. Set the bending to 1 for both the stiffness and the damping. Then for this simulation, we don't need to use springs or pressure, so you can just shut those. But you want to open up collisions. If you've got a really slow computer, you can leave this at 2, but I'm just going to set mine to 5 and click self collisions again. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is basically just the same way that we got our first starting position. We just want to animate our cloth moving forward a little bit. So just make sure to turn on your X-ray toggle just so you can see through the mesh. Then you want to click the cylinder. Then shift click the sphere, but you'll see that it's a little bit hard, so you can just go up to here, click the cylinder, and then hold Control and click the sphere. So now hit Control, P, and select Object Keep Transform. Now if we were to click the sphere and move, you'll see that it brings the cylinders along with it. Okay, so let's add some animation before we add our cloth simulation. Click on our cloth just so we can hide it for the time being. Head over to the physics properties and you can just click this little icon. That way we can still see our cloth, but for now we won't have any simulation happening. Click the sphere again. We're going to animate on the X to bring our ghost forward, and we're going to rotate on the Z. Just again, make sure to be on frame 1. Head up to the top here. Right click and insert single keyframe for the X, and we're going to do the same thing for the Z rotation. Awesome, so then just hit this to go to the last frame in the animation. Click X and we're going to type in -50. Right click and insert single keyframe. Then we can just come back to frame 1, and for our Z we're going to do something a little different. So just come up to the left to the top of the screen until you see this little plus symbol. Then click and drag to add a new window. Click here and we're going to go to the graph editor. You can see the curves over here as well. Obviously this is quite large, so if we just hit normalize, you'll see that it brings it into view. So let's click our Z rotation. Next we'll hit N to open up our properties. Then click modifiers. Click here and we're going to add a noise, which if we hit play you'll see is kind of giving our mesh a jittery effect. So let's just make some changes here, and I found the best values to be somewhere around 40 and 1.4. Keep in mind that if you go too much higher than this, you will get your sphere kind of rotating almost perpendicular, which maybe is what you want, but I'd rather just keep it a little bit more subtle. So now you'll see a little problem that we have here. Once we added that noise, our starting rotation is not 0, which it needs to be in order to match our cloth. So since we've got a keyframe here, moving this to 0 won't really do anything. So what we can do is if you just go over here to the offset, you can just click and drag this until you get something very close to 0. Click here. And in my case, an offset of 1.9 brings this pretty close to 0, which is very, very close. You don't need to worry about that little extra. And if you want to know what this is doing, if you just zoom in here to the first frame, if I were to change this back, you can see that when our wave crosses frame 1, it's actually down here as opposed to 0. So again, setting this to 1.9 will get it close enough. So now that we've got everything set up, we can just turn off our X-ray, click our cloth, and we're ready to do our second bake. So let's just head over to the physics properties, scroll all the way down to cache. I'm just going to shut this window just in case you've got a smaller screen. So I'll set this to 120. Just make sure that you go all the way up to the top, and then you need to make sure that we turn our simulation back on by clicking this little icon. And while we're at it, we might want to add a bit more mass to our cloth, so let's just type in 1 kilogram. Then now we're ready to bake, and this should only take a minute or 2. So you can hit play, and then you just want to find a frame that feels good to you. So head over to the modifiers properties, click here, and we can apply our cloth. Now of course you'll see that if we go back to frame 1, our sphere heads back and our cloth does not. So just before we head back to frame 1, we just want to write down what frame that you applied your simulation on. So in my case, it was frame 120. Now if you click on the sphere, you'll see 2 numbers here. One is the X value and the other is the Z rotation. So you just click this here, hold Control and hit C to copy. Then we'll head back to frame 1. Click our cloth, click here, and Control V to paste. Now if we hit enter, you can see of course it goes the wrong way, so we just want to get rid of the minus. And now it's matching up, but of course the last thing we need to do is just to change our rotation. So one more time, just click the sphere and go to frame 120, or whichever frame you applied your simulation on. Control copy this value, back to frame 1, click here and Control V. Then you can right click and replace single keyframe. It's not showing yellow, but if you just go back to frame 1 again, you'll see that it shows up now. And our cloth is matching perfect. Okay, so that starting frame is better. But again, once we add our subdivision surface, it's going to look a lot better. Remove that for now. Then again, we want to do one more simulation. So click on the cloth, Control A, and scale all of the transforms. Right click, and we're going to set the origin to the geometry. Okay, so for the last time, we'll just head over to the physics properties, click on cloth. Then again, we'll change this to 1, tension and compression to 25, and bending to 1. Then all the way to the bottom, change this if you can, and self collisions. So save again and bake. Okay, so now that we're done our final bake, we can watch our simulation, but since we no longer need our collisions, what you can do is click on the ground plane, head over to the physics, and just click X. This way, when you hit play, you'll get a little bit quicker of a viewport response. Okay, so everything is looking really good. So if we want to make this look a little bit better, we can just head over to our modifiers. Click here, and we're going to click subdivision surface. Again, we just want to pay attention to our order here. In this case, this is correct. You definitely don't want to have the subdivision before the cloth simulator, or else your simulation is going to try to calculate the original subdivisions, including all the ones that you add. So again, just make sure that this is underneath and set the viewport and render to 1 or 2. Okay, so that's basically it for our simulation. All we need to do now is add our materials. Make sure to save. Then you can head over to the shading tab and we can just set up our view. Then the first thing I like to do before I add materials is make sure I do a bit of lighting. So I head up to the right here and just click on the render preview. you'll see that we just got this gray reflection. So head over to the world properties, and instead of having a color, we can click this dot and select environment texture. Then hit open. If you want to use the HDRI that I'm using, you can grab it for free from my Patreon page. Just use the link in the description. No need to sign up, and just click here to download. Once you've unzipped that folder, you can find it on your hard drive. Click and click open. So the hardest part is over. We just need to add a few quick textures. So you can just click on the cloth and click new. Then just select the principled shader and hit delete. So first we want to add a mix shader, so Shift A, click search, and you can type in mix and click mix shader. Then we can hook this up to the surface. Shift A again, search, and we're going to search for translucent. Make sure you select translucent and not transparent. Then add this to the top socket. Shift A and search for emission. Hook this into the bottom. Then we want to set our strength to 3. Then we can add a nice blue color. Okay, so basically right now we just have our two shaders mixing 50% each, but what we want to do instead is separate these. So the way we're going to do that for this tutorial is hit Shift A, search, then type in layer and click layer weight. Then there's just two options here, so in our case we're just going to use the facing option and hook this up to the factor. Now you'll see that we're getting a little bit nicer of a result, but let's just take this a little further by changing the blend on the layer weight to 0.15. Great, so that's more or less my cloth material. I use cycles for mine, so if you click over, you can see that it's looking very much like my final result. Click here and go back to Eevee. Then if you want, you can just add a little bit of color to this as well. So that's it for our cloth. Next we need to do our ground plane. So again, this is a super easy shader, so just click new. We can change the base color to something bluish. Then we just want to bring this metallic all the way up to 1. Okay, so Shift A and search for bump. Normal to normal. Shift A and search for brick. Then we want to grab the color and hook it into roughness and into the height. Okay, so let's just turn off our overlays up here just so we can see a little bit better. Then we'll just click on scale and set that to 20. If you want to get that twisty effect that I got, we just need to add one more node, so Shift A and search for noise. Then grab the color and hook it into the vector and change the scale to 1. That's it for our ground plane, so we can just turn our overlays back on just so we can see again. So that's pretty much everything. All we need to do now is just add a couple more geometries, a light, and we'll be finished. So head back to the layout tab and you can just leave it to flat shading for now. Shift A to add a mesh, click cube, then we'll hit G and Y just to bring this over to the side. S to scale and type in 0.5, and we'll just bring it over just a little bit. Bring this up. Then we just need to scale it on the x-axis. You'll remember that our plane was 10 by 10. Currently our scale is set to 0.5, so we're going to want to scale this by 20. So S, X, and type in 20. Then click. Now that that's in position, we just want to scale everything back to default, so hold Control A and all transforms. Then just make sure you're in the modifiers properties. Click here and we're going to add a mirror. Select Y. Then one more modifier, array. Change the X value to -1 and set this to 6. By the way, for my final animation, I did like 25. But the cool thing about this is because we still have these on, you can change them at any time. Okay, so we've got our curves, so now we can just make our edges here. So click on our ground plane. Then we can duplicate by holding Shift, hit D. Then we'll just hit Y just so we can bring it over on the Y axis. Click, and then we'll just bring it up, G, Z, and hold Shift. Then just before we mirror this, we're just going to make our wall as well. So Shift D, Y to bring it over. Bring this to about halfway, R to rotate, X, and type in -90. Then GZ just to bring this up. Okay, so let's just click on our sidewalk here. Click modifiers, and we're going to add a mirror to the Y axis. Select Y, and the last thing, of course, we need to scale our transforms, so Control A and click. Let's do the same for our wall, so scale our transforms, Control A, all transforms, then modifier, mirror, and select the Y. Awesome, so that's all of our geometry. If we were to just go back into our render preview, you can see that we've got the same texture. So let's just click our sidewalk, head over to the materials properties, and let's just remove this from material. Click new, and we'll just change this to something with a lower value. Bring up the metallic, and you can just bring down the roughness as well. Then just make note of which material this is named, so material 2. Click the walls, and we'll just click here and switch to material 2. Now it's time to add our camera, so just find a spot that you like, Shift A, and we're going to click camera. Then you're going to hold Control and Alt at the same time and push 0 on the numpad. Now you can use your transforms just to move your camera, or if you'd rather do it like a video game, hit F3, type in walk, then you can use your mouse to orbit, arrow keys to go in and out, E and Q to go up and down. Then if you just want to have a bit of a background, you can just head over to the render properties, head down to film, open, and we'll uncheck transparent. If I turn off the overlays, things are looking really good. If you want your scene to extend further backwards, just click on each of these objects, head over to the modifiers properties, and you can add more by just upping the amount. Awesome, so I also had a light with my ghost here, so that's super easy to do. Just hit Shift A, go to light and select point. Then you just want to bring this up G and Z. You can turn on flat shading and X-ray toggle just so you can see. Then you just want to bring this right into the center. While you still got the light selected, Control click sphere, then back in the 3D viewport, Control P and keep transform. Now if we hit play, you'll see that the light stays with our ghost. So back into render preview, head over to the light properties, and you can just crank this and change the color. So let's just head back into our camera view by clicking here. For my final render, I use cycles, so I'm just going to switch over to cycles. This sphere is still giving a bit of a weird result, so you can just hide that. Again, if you're hiding something in the viewport, just make sure that you also hide it in the render. Add the render toggle and just make sure to turn it off as well. And feel free to do the same for the cylinders too. Awesome, and then the very final thing you can do is just go to the camera, head over to the camera properties, and add some depth of field. You can select your focus point as the sphere and change the f-stop to something a lot lower. Now we've got our final animation. You can see there's a little bit of gap here, so just make sure to select the ground plane, scale, and hit Y, hold shift, and you can just move this out just a little bit. So if you would like this to be a little bit darker, you can just head over to the world properties and set this to something much lower like 0.1. So now you can see that we've got a completely darkened background and just the focus on our ghost. Okay, so if you're happy with your setup, you can just head over to the rendering tab. Make sure to turn on things like motion blur. Also, if you're using Blender 2.9, make sure to add some denoise by opening up this tab. Turn this on, render, and render image. So I hope you all enjoyed this tutorial. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. And again, if you're able to help me a little further, you can sign up to become a member on my Patreon page. Okay, I'll see you next week. Bye!